November 14, 1942. Battle of Guadalcanal. USS South Dakota is caught in a brutal night battle against the Japanese battleship Times, Kirishima Times, and her escorting cruisers and destroyers. Shells rip through her decks, fires rage, and sailors die where they stand with deadly scream. Amid the chaos, a 12-year-old seaman fights the flames in a magazine compartment, sealing vents and flooding powder lockers, saving the ship from exploding and keeping her in the fight. Hours later, scarred but afloat, USS South Dakota survives, and the battle is won. His name was Calvin Leon Graham, the youngest U.S. serviceman in WWII. 4 months earlier, he'd walked into the Houston recruiting office, dropped his voice, and handed over papers bearing a shaky imitation of his mother's signature and a stolen notary stamp. He claimed he was 17. Boot camp didn't catch it, and the Navy didn't argue with a kid who could pull a line and keep his head when steel screamed. Born in the 3rd of April 1930, Texas, he'd grown up hard in Houston during the Depression. After basic training, he was sent to the Philadelphia Navy Yard and assigned as a seaman 2nd class, USS South Dakota. That is how a 12-year-old from Texas found himself on a frontline battleship steaming toward Guadalcanal. Now he's under Turret 2 on South Dakota in the Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, a night-knife fight in a sea crowded with wrecks and ghosts. Battleship Washington looms in the darkness astern. Ahead, the Japanese come in hard. Kirishima with her 14-inch rifles, heavy cruisers Atago and Takao out on the flank, Nagara and destroyers threading in and out like sharks. South Dakota has just suffered a catastrophic electrical failure. Half the ship goes black, radios stutter, directors lose power. In that instant of blindness, the enemy finds her. Searchlights snap on. The silhouette of Sodak becomes a target board. Calvin moves the way he learned to move in the alleys behind the sawmill, fast, low, shoulder first. The first volley slams into the superstructure. A 6-inch burst opens a ragged hole in the port side of the forward 40mm tub. A near miss lifts the deck under his feet. He tumbles, sprawls, grabs the hose again. Fire is the enemy's favorite ally on a warship. It turns steel into tinder and makes ammunition into a pinion. Calvin yanks the bale open. Foam spills white over burning paint. He keeps the stream steady while a gun captain's blood runs down the scupper and mixes with seawater. Someone screams, "Ready service lockers hot." The locker is a steel box the size of a wardrobe, full of 5-inch powder cartridges and shells meant for quick reload. One stray spark inside, and the side of the ship tears open like a tin can. Calvin drops the hose to his boot, wedges it with his foot to keep pressure on the flames, and sprints with 2 other sailors to dog shut the locker's vent. The handwheel is scorched. He wraps a rag around his palm and cranks. The vent slams. He heaves the CO2 bottle, pulls the pin, and drowns the seam until frost grows on the metal. The magazine sprinklers chatter alive. Someone finally finds the flooding valve. A blast hurls him face first into a stanchion. His lip opens. He tastes iron. He stands up anyway. A boatswain's mate 30 maybe stares at him through powder grime and barks, "Kid, where's your chief?" Calvin points at a shape on the deck that isn't moving. "I'll do it," he says, and he goes. Washington's 16-inch rifles begin speaking then. 4 salvos, then 6, then the steady thunder of a capital ship finding the range. Kirishima starts to glow from within, armor plate rippling in orange patches under armor-piercing hits. South Dakota, still blind and burning, keeps taking punishment. Splinters, fragments, a string of 8-inch hits from the cruisers walk across her topside. Calvin runs messages by hand because the sound-powered phones in this section are dead. A corpsman shouts for help. Calvin drags a wounded loader leg gone at the knee through a maze of hot metal and drops him behind the barbette where the blast won't tear him apart. The deck pitches. He lays flat as tracers lace the air just above his back. A shower of sparks leaps from a shattered director. For a heartbeat, the world is fireworks and burning cork. Calvin rolls, slaps, smothers. He's not thinking about medals, or history, or what a judge would say if anyone knew he was 12. He's thinking about the 5-inch ready locker 2 bulkheads down that must not cook off. He's thinking about the foam pattern on the fire, keeping the edge cool. He's thinking about the way the deck plates hum when Washington fires and how, if he can hear that, the big sister behind them is still alive. And so are they. Tonight, the Navy will count tons of steel and calibers of guns. It will not tally a barefoot East Texas kid's stubborn refusal to let flames find powder. But that's what keeps a battleship fighting. Men who do not break. By 0100, South Dakota is bleeding from more than 40 shell hits, communications gutted, radar out, but afloat. Washington hammers Kirishima to a slow, smoking death. Calvin leans on his hose until there's only steam and the chemical stink of suppressant. His jaw throbs. He wipes blood with a sleeve and grins anyway. He got away with a lie big enough to walk onto a battleship. In the worst 15 minutes of her life, he earned the right to be there. At dawn, November 15th, 1942, Ironbottom Sound looked like a scrapyard of nations. The sea boiled with burning oil, shattered hulls, and drifting bodies, Japanese and American, indistinguishable in the gray light. USS South Dakota limped east at 8 knots, her decks scorched black, her superstructure shredded by shrapnel. Her radio antennas hung in tatters. The forward rangefinder was gone. She had taken 26 major hits. And somewhere amid the ruin, 12-year-old seaman Calvin Graham was still moving, shirt torn, face blackened, carrying buckets of water from a ruptured fire main to cool what the hoses couldn't reach. He had been awake for nearly 20 hours. His hands were blistered and bleeding from rope burns where the hose had kicked. Every breath tasted of cordite and paint dust. He didn't care. The ship was alive, and so was he. Below deck, the real danger still lurked. A hit during the night had ruptured insulation and ignited smoldering paint deep in the forward ammunition trunk. The powder magazines, each holding tons of 14-inch propellant charges, were just one stray spark away from turning the South Dakota into a crater in the sea. The ventilation was gone, temperatures rising. The engineering crew had already sealed off the compartment, but smoke was leaking through seams in the bulkhead. The ship's firefighting detail was stretched thin, half their men wounded. A call came through the passageway. Fire spreading near forward magazine. Need volunteers. Calvin didn't hesitate. The officer in charge looked at him, blinked once, maybe realizing just then how small he really was, but there was no time for questions. Fine. Grab a CO, 2 bottle. Stay behind me. The passageway was a tunnel of heat and flickering red. Paint peeled off the bulkheads in curls. The deck plates burned through the soles of their shoes. They reached the outer door of the magazine. The handle glowed dull orange. The petty officer tried the dogs. One refused to budge. He swore, jammed a wrench on it. Calvin saw a strip of flame crawling up the seam near the hinge. He dropped to his knees, pressed the CO2 horn against it, and opened the valve full. The gas roared white, frost racing up the steel. The flame vanished. He crawled closer, eyes watering. The metal hissed, cooling. The chief kicked the handle. The door moved. Inside, the compartment was hell in miniature smoke, glowing embers, a stack of shells sweating tar from the heat. The overhead fire main was ruptured. Water dripped uselessly. They needed pressure. The chief turned back toward the ladder. "Stay here," he barked. "Keep it cold." Then he vanished into the smoke. Calvin stood alone in that compartment, every instinct telling him to run. He thought of the deck above, the gunners, the men asleep in their bunks who didn't know that a powder magazine was about to blow under them. He kept the CO2 flowing, sweeping it across the deck, watching frost form on the shell casings. His arms trembled from the weight of the bottle. The gas ran out. He tossed it aside, grabbed a second from the rack. 10 minutes later, the water pressure came back. The sprinkler system sputtered, then hissed to life. Steam rolled up as the fire died. Calvin staggered out, soaked, coughing, his eyebrows burned away. The chief met him halfway down the passage. "Good work, sailor," he said. Then he saw Calvin's face clearly for the first time, smooth skin, no beard shadow, eyes too big for the helmet. "How old are you?" he asked. Calvin's answer came flat. 17, sir." The chief stared another moment, then nodded. 17, it is. By the time South Dakota reached Noumea for repairs, her damage report read like an autopsy: superstructure shredded, secondary battery wrecked, 57 killed, nearly 100 wounded. But she was still afloat, still fighting. And word about a kid gunner who'd stood through the fire and saved a magazine started spreading through the task force. In Tokyo, the Imperial Navy's analysis of the battle noted that the enemy battleship second in line displayed abnormal resistance and fire discipline, even under multiple gun hits. They didn't know her fire discipline came from a boy who had lied about his age and refused to flinch. When the wounded were offloaded, Calvin refused a stretcher. His left jaw was stitched without anesthetic supply shortage, they said, and he didn't make a sound. A Navy photographer caught him afterward, sitting on the deck, eyes swollen, still holding a canteen he'd been using to douse flames. The picture ran later in Stars and Stripes, with a caption that didn't mention his age. At the medical tent, a corpsman offered him a cigarette. Calvin tried one puff, coughed, and laughed. "Guess I ain't old enough for that yet." He was old enough for a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart, though he didn't know it yet. For the moment, all he cared about was sleep. He dropped onto a cot in a canvas tent, the Pacific wind rattling the flaps, and for the first time in days, let the war fade into silence. Outside, the dockworkers stared at the South Dakota's scars and whispered that no ship should have survived that night. But she had, and so had the smallest sailor aboard her. 3 weeks later, December 1942, the USS South Dakota sits in dry dock at Tongatabu, a jagged monument to survival. Burned steel, twisted ladders, holes big enough to crawl through. The dockyard crews call her Battleship X, a name whispered with awe. Official reports won't say where she's been or how close she came to detonation. But the men who were there know, and among them, stories about one sailor spread faster than the welder's torches. They say he was the one who shut the vent to the ready locker before it went up, that he dragged a wounded loader out by his belt when the deck was burning under him, that he fought the fire in the magazine until the CO2 bottles ran dry. None of them can agree on how old he is. 17? 15? Nobody believes the truth. 12 years, 6 months, and 4 days. Calvin Graham spends the ship's repair period with the damage control team. His uniform is a size too big, the cuffs rolled up twice. He patches hoses, cleans nozzles, learns how to splice line in half the time it takes anyone else. He's too short to lift the heavier fire bottles alone, so he rigs a 2-rope sling to drag them. The older sailors watch him work, shake their heads, and stop asking questions. They've all seen him bleed. The ship's executive officer finally notices the rumors. He calls Calvin to his office. The boy reports in, chin up, jaw stitched but steady. The XO studies him for a long time. "Seaman Graham," he says, "men say you kept fighting after being hit. That true?" "Yes, sir." "Why didn't you go below for treatment?" "Didn't think it'd help the fire, sir." The XO leans back. "You're from Texas, right? Big cattle country. You ever think you might have joined a little early?" Calvin meets his eyes. "No, sir. I joined when I could." The officer's mouth twitches, not quite a smile. "Then carry on, sailor." By January, South Dakota is repaired and sailing north again. Calvin stands his station on the 40mm mount, wearing a helmet that keeps sliding over his ears. He's gained 6 pounds since Guadalcanal. The ship's crew treats him like a mascot, half little brother, half good luck charm, but he doesn't act like one. During gunnery drills, he moves with the focus of someone twice his age. The chief gunner says he's all eyes and hands. When the twin Beauforts hammer, he watches how the recoil rocks the mount, notes how the loaders feed the belts, times the rhythm. It's instinct, not training. He can see how systems fit together, how men and metal behave under stress. That knack makes him useful. When an ammunition hoist jams during a drill, he's the first to crawl into the shaft, grease-stained and grinning, to free the roller. When the ventilation duct floods with steam after a gasket blows, he's the one who patches it with wet canvas and clamps before pressure drops. It's not bravado, it's restlessness. He's a kid who's learned that hesitation gets people killed. The Navy doesn't give 12-year-olds leave, but the South Dakota's crew does something better. They teach him everything they know. How to read the sea by its color. How to splice signal flags. How to tell from sound alone when a bearing is going bad. At night, in the mess, they pass him stories of ships gone under and men who didn't come back. He listens, memorizes, asks questions the way some kids ask for bedtime tales. When Admiral Halsey's communique comes through the one crediting South Dakota and Washington with breaking the back of Japan's surface fleet at Guadalcanal, the crew gathers on deck to hear it read. The Admiral calls them the backbone of the Pacific. Someone yells, "To Calvin Graham, the ship's lucky star!" And the deck erupts in cheers. Calvin tries to hide in the crowd, face red under the soot, but he smiles anyway. For a moment, he's not a stowaway in history. He's a sailor. Half a world away, the Japanese Naval General Staff reviews the same battle reports. The Kirishima is gone. 4 destroyers lost, 2 cruisers crippled. Their analysts note with cold precision that American battleship fire discipline remains excellent despite casualties. What they don't know is that discipline came, in part, from a boy refusing to let a fire reach powder. To them, it's another example of American material advantage. To the men who watched Calvin that night, it's something else, proof that courage doesn't care about age. In late January, South Dakota heads for the States for a full refit. The crew is given liberty in New York. Calvin's too young for bars, too young for shore patrol to ignore, but the older sailors sneak him along anyway. He wears a borrowed pea coat, cap pulled low. When they walk down Broadway, people stop to stare at the battleship men, heroes of the Pacific. Calvin stares back at the lights, 12 years old and feeling, for once, as big as the city around him. He doesn't know that his story, his secret, is about to surface. In a few weeks, his mother will read a newspaper photo of the baby-faced hero of Guadalcanal, and the Navy will have questions. But for now, standing on a pier with the Hudson wind in his hair, Calvin Graham is just a sailor watching the water, waiting for orders, already planning where he'll be when the next fight comes. February 1943. Brooklyn Navy Yard. The South Dakota towers above the dry dock like a wounded giant. Her decks are stripped, her scars open to daylight. Welders swarm over her like ants. For most of the crew, it's a quiet reward: shore leave, letters home, warm meals. For Calvin Graham, it's a problem. Shore patrols check IDs more carefully in New York than they ever did in the Pacific. And Calvin's ID card, carefully typed with a forged birth date and a shaky signature, is starting to look suspiciously thin. He's tried to stay invisible. He works maintenance details, polishes brass until it gleams, helps rig fire hoses for dockside testing. But it's hard to hide when the New York Times runs an article about the boy hero of Guadalcanal, accompanied by a grainy photo taken aboard ship, a small figure in oversized gear, face smeared with soot, grin wide as daylight. The story doesn't name him, but it doesn't have to. Word spreads through the docks, down to the Navy office, across to the personnel department. A clerk double-checks records. The math doesn't add up. 2 days later, Calvin is called to the executive officer's cabin. The XO, who once pretended not to notice, now looks tired, almost regretful. "Seaman Graham," he says quietly. Headquarters. Wants to confirm your birth certificate. Calvin's throat tightens. Yes, sir. Young man, the XO says. What year were you born? Calvin stares straight ahead. 1929, sir. The XO exhales. That makes you 13? Calvin says nothing. The next morning, Naval Intelligence arrives with papers. They've already contacted Crockett, Texas. His mother has told them everything. Forged signature, false affidavit, runaway. The truth detonates through the ship like a delayed shell. He's confined to quarters while the brass decide what to do. The crew, his crew, doesn't abandon him. Gunners sneak him food. A machinist's mate gives him a comic book. The chief who'd seen him fight the magazine fire stops by at night and leaves an extra blanket. No one calls him kid anymore. They call him sailor, and it sounds like respect. A week later, orders come down. Calvin Graham is to be discharged for fraudulent enlistment. No ceremony, no appeal. His decorations, Bronze Star, Purple Heart, will be withheld pending review. Officially, he's never fought at Guadalcanal. Unofficially, every man who saw him there knows otherwise. On February 25, 1943, Calvin stands on the pier in borrowed civilian clothes. The warship that had been his world looms behind him, her guns silent, her decks crawling with welders. The XO walks down to see him off. You should have been born 5 years earlier, he says. You'd have made chief by the end of the war. Calvin smiles a little. Guess I got a head start, sir. The XO hands him an envelope, his pay for 6 months, and a folded photograph. The South Dakota at sea, taken before Guadalcanal. Keep it, the XO says, so you don't forget. He doesn't. Back in Texas, the war feels like another planet. The train home smells of coal and coffee. People stare at the short kid in a navy coat with bandaged hands. When he steps off at Crockett Station, his mother is waiting. She hugs him hard, then hits him lightly on the shoulder. You lied to me, she says, voice shaking. You could have been killed. Calvin just nods. A lot of men were, Ma. I just didn't want to be one of the ones who stayed home. He tries to go back to school, but sitting behind a desk after surviving naval gunfire feels impossible. He's older in ways no one can see. He takes odd jobs, carpentry, deliveries, anything that keeps him moving. When people ask about the burn scars on his neck, he says they're from welding accidents. He doesn't mention the night when Japanese shells turned his ship into a furnace. By the summer of '43, the Navy's official silence starts to break. A Life magazine correspondent digs up the story. The child who went to war, the article calls him. Readers can't believe it. A 12-year-old in a battleship's fire control team under live fire at Guadalcanal. Letters flood the Navy Department, some outraged, most proud. Congressmen mention his name in hearings. A senator from Texas calls it courage beyond comprehension. Tokyo Rose, the Japanese propagandist broadcasting over Radio Tokyo, even mentions it once. The American Navy sends children to die in steel coffins. The High Command notes it in a report on U.S. morale, an oddity, an anomaly, a curiosity. But among the senior admirals, there's unease. A Navy that trains its sons to fight is dangerous. A nation whose children fight without orders is unstoppable. In the autumn of 1943, the Navy finally returns his medals. Quietly. No ceremony, no press. The Bronze Star citation reads, "For distinguished heroism and devotion to duty under fire while serving aboard USS South Dakota during the Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal." The Purple Heart comes with a note. Injured by enemy action. November 14, 1942. They don't mention his age. They don't have to. Calvin puts the medals in a drawer and says nothing. He's 13 years old and already a veteran of one of the hardest nights in naval history. He doesn't brag, doesn't parade. When asked what the war was like, he says, loud. What he doesn't say is that he still dreams of the sound steel groaning, fire roaring, the deck trembling under 14-inch guns. He wakes up some nights thinking he's back under turret 2, hose in hand, eyes stinging, praying that the next shell won't find the magazine. He won't be the last kid to lie his way into war, but he'll be the only one whose lie saved a battleship. Spring, 1944. Houston, Texas. The war is everywhere in the newspapers, on the radio, in the faces of families who hang blue stars in their windows. But for Calvin Graham, the war is over. He's 13, back in school, too young for a car and too old for childhood. His classmates still trade marbles at recess. He reads the headlines about Tarawa and Anzio. He doesn't fit anywhere. The other kids call him Navy Boy. They don't mean it kindly. Teachers scold him for staring out the window when he's supposed to be reciting history lessons, history that he's lived. When he tries to talk about Guadalcanal, they don't believe him. The idea of a 12-year-old fighting aboard a battleship sounds like a lie. He stops trying to explain. His stepfather, a stern man who's never forgiven Calvin for running away, calls him a fool with medals. His mother hides those medals in a drawer, afraid someone will steal them. Calvin takes night work, stacking boxes at a warehouse, just to get away from the house. He still keeps his Navy-issued jacket, the one with the salt stains on the cuffs. It's too small now, but he won't throw it away. By August, the war feels distant, fought by other men. Then the telegrams start arriving around town, sons, brothers, cousins, killed at Saipan, in the Marianas, at Normandy. People who once called him a liar now look at him differently. They ask him what it's like, what fear smells like. He never gives them the full truth. Hot metal and cordite, he says, and leaves it at that.